The small town was the kind of place where most days felt the same. People woke up early, opened their shops, sent their children to school, and talked about the same things again and again. Everyone seemed to know each other. News traveled quickly from one street to another, and nothing unusual ever seemed to happen. But in a quiet corner of that town lived a young boy whose life was very different from the lives most people saw. The boy lived with his mother in a small, worn apartment above an old grocery store. The building was old and the paint on the walls had faded long ago. The stairs creaked loudly whenever someone walked up or down them. Their home had only 2 small rooms, a tiny kitchen, and one narrow window that looked out over the street below. It was not much, but it was the only place they could afford. His mother worked long hours every day. She cleaned houses around town and sometimes helped at the bakery early in the morning. Her hands were often tired and rough from work, but she never complained. Every evening she came home carrying a small bag of groceries and a warm smile for her son. No matter how tired she was, she always asked him about his day. The boy loved his mother very much. He could see how hard she worked just to keep their life going. Because of that, he rarely asked for anything. While other kids talked about new toys, phones, or video games, he stayed quiet. He knew those things were not possible for them. At school, life was not always easy for him. Many students came from families that had more money and nicer things. They wore clean new clothes and carried shiny backpacks. The boy's clothes were simple and sometimes a little worn out. His shoes had been repaired more than once, and his backpack had a small tear that his mother had carefully stitched closed. Some students noticed these things and whispered about them. A few laughed when they thought he could not hear. The boy tried not to let it bother him, but sometimes their words stayed in his mind longer than he wanted. He was a quiet child who spent most of his time observing the world around him. While other children ran loudly through the hallways during breaks, he often sat near the window in the school corridor. From there, he could watch the trees moving in the wind and listen to the distant sounds of the playground. There was one place in the school that fascinated him more than anywhere else. It was the large auditorium near the back of the building. Most students only went there during assemblies or school events, but the boy loved walking past its doors whenever he had the chance. Inside that auditorium stood an old piano on the stage. It was not a brand new instrument. In fact, it had clearly been there for many years. The wooden surface had small scratches, and the bench looked slightly faded. But to the boy, it looked beautiful. The first time he heard the piano being played was during a school ceremony months earlier. A teacher had performed a short piece of music before the event began. The moment the first notes filled the room, the boy felt something strange and powerful inside him. The sound seemed to travel through the air and straight into his heart. He had never heard music like that so closely before. From that day on, the sound of piano music stayed in his mind. Sometimes he would tap his fingers on the desk during class, quietly copying rhythms he remembered. Other times he would imagine what it might feel like to press those keys himself. But he never told anyone about these thoughts. He knew that learning piano usually required lessons, instruments, and money. Those were things his family did not have. So the dream stayed quietly inside him, like a secret he carried everywhere. One afternoon, as he walked down the hallway after school, he noticed a colorful poster hanging on the notice board. Several students had gathered around it, reading it excitedly. It announced the school's annual talent show. Every year students performed different acts on the auditorium stage. Some sang songs, others danced, and a few played musical instruments. The event always attracted a large audience of parents, teachers, and students. The hallway buzzed with excitement as everyone talked about what they might perform. The boy stood slightly behind the crowd, reading the poster silently. His eyes slowly moved across the words again and again. For a moment, a small thought appeared in his mind. What if he could play the piano there? The idea felt both exciting and impossible at the same time. He had never touched the piano before. He had never taken a single lesson, and most people in school hardly even noticed him. Still, the thought would not disappear. Later that day, when most students had already gone home, the boy walked slowly through the quiet school hallway. The building felt very different when it was empty. The usual noise of students and teachers was gone. Only the faint sound of the wind outside could be heard. He found himself standing in front of the auditorium doors. For a few seconds he hesitated. Then he gently pushed one door open. The room was large and silent. Rows of empty chairs faced the stage, and soft light from the windows touched the wooden floor. At the center of the stage sat the piano he had admired for so long. His heart began beating faster. Step by step, he walked down the aisle and climbed onto the stage. Standing next to the piano felt strange, almost unreal. Up close, he could see every detail of the instrument. Slowly, he sat down on the bench. For a moment, he just stared at the keys. They were smooth and slightly cool beneath his fingers. He remembered the melody the teacher had played months ago. He tried to recall how the notes had sounded. Carefully, he pressed one key. A clear sound filled the empty auditorium. The boy quickly looked around, worried someone might hear him. But the room remained quiet. After a moment, curiosity overcame his fear. He pressed another key, then another. The sounds were simple, but they made him smile. Something about the piano felt natural, as if his fingers already understood the instrument in a quiet way. He began experimenting, pressing keys slowly and listening carefully to each note. Some combinations sounded strange, but others created small pieces of melody. Minutes passed without him noticing. Eventually he stood up, realizing it was getting late. Before leaving, he looked back at the piano once more. A quiet idea formed in his mind. Maybe he could come back tomorrow. And the next day he did exactly that. After classes ended, he waited until most students had gone home. Then he slipped quietly into the auditorium again. This time he walked straight to the piano. Day by day, the visits continued. Each afternoon he spent a little time practicing. At first his playing was slow and uncertain, but his ears listened carefully to every sound. Whenever a note felt wrong, he tried again until it sounded better. Music slowly began forming beneath his fingers. Sometimes the school janitor passing through the hallway paused for a moment, wondering where the quiet music was coming from. But the boy always left before anyone discovered him. At home, his mother noticed something new about him. He seemed happier. Even after long school days, he carried a quiet energy that had not been there before. When she asked about it, he simply smiled and said school had been fine. The secret stayed safely inside him. As the weeks passed, the talent show grew closer. Posters appeared everywhere around the school. Students practiced their performances and talked excitedly about the upcoming event. The boy watched all of this quietly. Each afternoon he returned to the auditorium and practiced a little longer than before. His fingers slowly learned to move across the keys with more confidence. The melodies became smoother. The music became deeper. Sometimes, as he played, he imagined a large audience sitting in those empty chairs. The thought made him nervous, but it also filled him with determination. For the first time in his life, he felt that he had discovered something truly his own. Something special. Something that no one else had ever expected from the quiet boy in worn shoes. And although the world around him had not noticed yet, a small but powerful story had already begun to unfold inside that silent school auditorium. The quiet visits to the school auditorium slowly became the most important part of the boy's day. Every afternoon, after the final bell rang and students rushed out of the building, he moved more slowly than everyone else. He packed his worn backpack carefully and waited until the hallways grew quiet. Most students never noticed him leaving later than usual. They were busy talking about homework, sports practice, or what they planned to do after school. But the boy had something else waiting for him. As soon as the building felt calm and empty, he walked toward the back of the school where the auditorium stood. The tall wooden doors looked the same every day, but each time he pushed them open, his heart beat a little faster. Inside the room, the air felt peaceful. Rows of empty chairs faced the stage, and soft light came through the high windows. The old piano waited in the same place, silent and still. Every time he saw it, he felt a strange mix of excitement and nervousness. At first, he always looked around carefully to make sure no one else was there. Even though he loved playing, he still worried someone might suddenly walk in and laugh at him. The memory of students whispering about his clothes or his shoes stayed in his mind. But when he sat at the piano bench and placed his fingers on the keys, those worries slowly faded away. The piano had started to feel familiar to him. The keys were no longer strange. They felt like old friends waiting for him each day. During the first few afternoons, he had simply pressed random keys and listened to the sounds. But now he began to notice patterns. Some notes sounded calm and soft, while others felt bright and powerful. He discovered that when certain keys were played together, they created beautiful melodies. Slowly, he began remembering which notes sounded good next to each other. His ears guided him more than anything else. Sometimes he would close his eyes while playing. Without looking at the keys, he listened carefully to every sound. If something did not feel right, he tried again. Little by little, his hands started moving more smoothly. He was not learning from books or teachers. Everything came from listening, trying, and feeling the music. At home, the boy had an old radio that his mother had found at a second-hand market years earlier. The radio did not always work perfectly, but it could still play music from local stations. Many evenings, after finishing his homework, he sat near that radio and listened carefully to piano songs. Some were slow and emotional. Others were fast and joyful. While listening, he watched the movements of his own fingers, imagining the piano keys beneath them. The next day at school, he tried to copy those melodies as best as he could remember. Sometimes he succeeded. Other times he struggled, but he never stopped trying. Days turned into weeks. The boy's confidence slowly began to grow. At first, he had been afraid even to press the keys too loudly. Now his fingers moved more freely. The music flowing from the piano sounded fuller and stronger. One afternoon, while he was playing, he did not hear the quiet footsteps in the hallway outside. The school janitor had been pushing a cleaning cart down the corridor. As he passed the auditorium, he heard the sound of piano music drifting through the slightly open door. The janitor stopped walking. He stood there for a moment, listening quietly. The music was gentle but beautiful. It did not sound like someone practicing simple notes. It sounded like a real piece of music. Curious, he slowly pushed the door open just a little. Inside, he saw the boy sitting alone at the piano. The janitor watched silently from the doorway. The boy was completely focused on the music. His eyes were on the keys, and his fingers moved carefully but confidently. After a few moments, the janitor quietly closed the door again and walked away. He did not interrupt. Something about the scene felt special, and he did not want to disturb it. The boy never even realized someone had been listening. To him, those quiet afternoons were simply moments where he could finally breathe freely. At school, he often felt invisible, like just another face in the crowd. But when he played the piano, he felt different. He felt like he mattered. One evening, when he returned home, his mother was sitting at the small kitchen table repairing one of his shirts. A small lamp lit the room with a warm glow. She looked up as he entered. "You look happy today," she said with a gentle smile. The boy shrugged slightly and placed his backpack down. "School was okay," he replied. She studied his face for a moment. There was something new in his eyes, a quiet brightness she had not seen before. She did not ask more questions. She simply smiled again and returned to sewing. Later that night, as she cooked dinner, she hummed a soft melody like she often did. It was a habit she had kept from years earlier when life had been easier. The boy listened closely. The tune was simple but beautiful. Without realizing it, he began tapping the rhythm gently on the table with his fingers. The next afternoon, when he sat at the piano again, that same melody returned to his mind. Slowly, he tried to find the notes that matched the tune his mother had hummed. At first he struggled. The melody seemed simple, but finding the right keys took patience. Then suddenly, the notes lined up perfectly. The piano played the same gentle tune his mother had hummed in the kitchen. The boy smiled to himself. For a long moment, he repeated the melody again and again, making it smoother each time. That was the moment he realized something important. Music was not just about copying sounds from the radio. It was about feeling something inside and letting it come out through the keys. From that day on, his playing became more expressive. The melodies he practiced were not just correct notes. They carried emotion. Sometimes the music sounded soft and thoughtful. Other times it grew powerful and bold. As the talent show approached, excitement filled the school hallways. Students talked loudly about their performances. Some practiced dances during lunch breaks. Others sang together near the lockers. The boy listened to these conversations quietly. Part of him wondered what it would feel like to perform on that stage in front of everyone. The thought made his stomach twist with nervousness. But another part of him felt curious. Every afternoon, as he practiced alone in the auditorium, he imagined what the room might sound like if it were filled with people. He pictured rows of students watching him, teachers standing along the walls, and parents sitting in the front seats. The idea felt both frightening and thrilling. One afternoon, while he was playing a soft melody, he paused suddenly. He looked out across the empty chairs. For the first time, he asked himself a serious question. What if he actually performed in the talent show? His heart began beating faster just thinking about it. He imagined the reactions of the students who often laughed at him. He imagined the whispers spreading through the room when they saw him walk onto the stage. The fear was real, but something stronger had begun growing inside him over the past weeks. Confidence. The piano had slowly changed how he saw himself. He was no longer just the quiet boy who stayed in the corner. He had discovered a skill that made him feel strong and proud. Still, the idea of signing up for the talent show felt huge. He sat quietly at the piano bench for several minutes, thinking. Then he placed his fingers on the keys again and began playing the strongest melody he had practiced so far. The sound filled the empty auditorium with surprising power. For the first time, he imagined not just playing for himself, but playing for everyone. And deep inside, a quiet decision slowly began to form. For the next few days, the boy could not stop thinking about the talent show. The idea had planted itself deep in his mind. Every time he walked past the colorful posters in the hallway, his eyes paused on the same words. School talent show, sign up this week. Students gathered around the notice board almost every day. Some were excited, laughing as they talked about their performances. Others looked nervous but hopeful. Names were slowly being added to the list. The boy often stood a few steps away from the crowd, pretending to read something else while secretly looking at the growing list. Many students had already signed up. There were singers, dancers, and even a small group planning a comedy act. Someone had written their name beside guitar performance, and another beside magic tricks. But next to the word piano, the space was still empty. Every time he noticed that blank line, his heart beat a little faster. He wondered if anyone would laugh if they saw his name there. He imagined whispers spreading through the hallway. Did you see who signed up for piano? That quiet kid? No way. The thought made his stomach feel tight. At the same time, something inside him kept pushing the idea forward. Every afternoon when he practiced in the empty auditorium, the music sounded stronger than before. His fingers moved more smoothly across the keys. The melodies were no longer uncertain. Sometimes he forgot that he had never taken a lesson. One afternoon, after playing for almost an hour, he leaned back slightly on the piano bench. His hands rested in his lap while the final notes faded into silence. He looked out across the empty chairs again. The same chairs that would soon be filled with students, teachers, and parents. For a moment he imagined the sound of people talking, the rustling of programs, and the soft echo of footsteps in the room. Then he imagined himself walking onto that stage. The thought made his chest tighten. He shook his head quickly and stood up. The idea still felt too big, too risky. Maybe it was better if he simply kept playing here in private. The quiet afternoons had become his safe place. No one laughed at him here. No one judged him. But the thought would not disappear. The next morning at school, the hallway felt louder than usual. Students were excited because the deadline for talent show signups was that afternoon. The boy sat quietly in class, but his mind was somewhere else. When the final bell rang for lunch break, students rushed out of the classroom toward the cafeteria. Laughter and conversation filled the hallway. The boy walked slowly toward his locker. As he closed the locker door, he noticed the notice board again. A few students were gathered around it, pointing and talking about the list of performers. He hesitated. Then he slowly walked closer. The line beside piano performance was still empty. His heart began beating faster. He looked around the hallway. Most students were heading toward the cafeteria. The crowd near the board slowly moved away. For a brief moment, he found himself standing there alone. The pen attached to the sign-up sheet hung from a small string. His hand moved slightly. Then he stopped. Doubt rushed into his mind again. What if someone saw him writing his name? What if the students who often laughed at him started mocking him even more? He stepped back. But then another thought appeared. What if he never tried? What if years later he looked back and realized he had been too afraid to take one simple chance? The idea stayed in his mind for several long seconds. Finally, he stepped forward again. His hand reached for the pen. Slowly, carefully, he wrote his name on the blank line beside piano performance. The letters looked small compared to the other names on the page, but they were there. For a moment he simply stared at them. Then quickly, before his courage could disappear, he turned and walked down the hallway. His heart was beating so loudly he felt sure someone else could hear it. The rest of the school day passed slowly. During classes he kept wondering if anyone had noticed his name on the list. By the time the final bell rang, whispers had already begun spreading through the building. Several students had seen the sign-up sheet, and many of them were surprised. Near the lockers, two boys laughed quietly while looking at the list. "Did you see who signed up for piano?" one of them said. The other shook his head. "That quiet kid did." They both chuckled. "Seriously? That's going to be interesting." Nearby, a few other students overheard the conversation. Some looked confused, while others smiled in amusement. The news traveled quickly. By the end of the afternoon, quite a few students knew about it. The boy heard some of the whispers while walking through the hallway. A few people glanced at him and then turned to their friends with small smiles. He tried to ignore it. After school, he walked toward the auditorium like usual. The hallway felt longer than normal that day. When he opened the doors and stepped inside, the quiet room felt comforting again. The piano waited on the stage just as it always had. He sat down slowly and placed his hands on the keys. For a moment he did not play anything. Instead, he thought about the decision he had made. His name was now on the talent show list. There was no turning back. The idea made him nervous, but it also gave him a strange new energy. He took a deep breath and began playing. The melody started softly, like a calm conversation. Then it slowly grew stronger. Each note carried a piece of the emotions he was feeling. The fear, the excitement, the uncertainty, and the determination. As he played, the music filled the auditorium with surprising power. The boy practiced longer than usual that afternoon. He repeated the same sections again and again until his fingers moved smoothly. Whenever he made a mistake, he started over patiently. Outside the auditorium, the school janitor passed by again during his evening rounds. Once more, the sound of piano music caught his attention. He paused in the hallway, listening. The music sounded stronger than before, more confident. The janitor smiled quietly to himself and continued walking. Inside the auditorium, the boy finally stopped playing after what felt like hours. His hands rested on the keys while the last notes faded away. He looked out at the empty chairs again. Soon they would not be empty. Soon the entire school would be sitting there. Some would be curious. Some would expect him to fail. Some might even laugh. But for the first time in his life, the boy felt ready to face them. Because the piano was no longer just a dream in his mind. It had become a part of him. And no matter what happened on the night of the talent show, he knew one thing for certain. When he sat at that piano and played the first note, he would give it everything he had. The days before the talent show moved faster than the boy expected. What once felt far away was suddenly very close. Posters about the event were now everywhere in the school hallways. Teachers reminded students about it during class, and many students talked about nothing else during lunch breaks. Everywhere he went, he heard conversations about performances. Some students practiced songs together near their lockers. Others showed their dance routines to friends who clapped and laughed. The excitement in the school kept growing. The boy listened to these conversations quietly, but he rarely joined them. Most students did not even know he had signed up. A few had heard the rumor, and when they saw him walking by, they sometimes whispered to each other. One afternoon near the lockers, 2 students noticed him passing by. "Is that the one who signed up for piano?" one asked quietly. "I think so," the other replied with a small smile. Their voices were not loud, but the boy still heard them. He kept walking without looking back. Inside, he felt the familiar mixture of nerves and determination. The whispers made him uncomfortable, but they also reminded him why he had decided to perform. He wanted to prove something not to the students who laughed, but to himself. Each afternoon he continued practicing in the auditorium. The quiet room had become his second home. The moment he sat at the piano bench, the rest of the world seemed to disappear. His fingers moved more confidently now. The piece he planned to perform had slowly grown into something special. It started with soft, gentle notes that felt almost like a whisper. Then it built slowly into stronger, deeper melodies. Sometimes he imagined the music telling the story of his life. The quiet beginning reminded him of the small apartment and the long evenings when his mother came home tired from work. The stronger middle part felt like the struggle of school days and the moments when he felt invisible. And the final section of the music, that part felt like hope. Every day he tried to make that final section more powerful. One evening at home, while finishing dinner, his mother noticed something different again. "You seem very busy these days," she said gently while washing the dishes. The boy looked up from the table. "I'm just staying a little longer after school," he replied. "Working on something?" she asked with curiosity. He hesitated for a moment. Then he nodded. She smiled warmly but did not ask more questions. She had always trusted him, and she could tell he was working hard at something important. Later that night, the boy sat near the old radio again. A soft piano song played through the small speaker. The melody was beautiful, but instead of simply listening, he imagined how he would play his own music at the talent show. The thought made his hands feel slightly cold. Standing in front of a large audience would be very different from playing alone in the empty auditorium. But he reminded himself of the hours he had already spent practicing. The piano keys no longer felt strange to him. They felt natural. 2 days before the talent show, the school held a short rehearsal for students who would perform. Each participant had a few minutes to check the stage and prepare. When the boy walked into the auditorium that afternoon, it looked very different from the quiet place he knew. Bright lights had been set up near the stage. Teachers moved chairs and checked microphones. A few students waited nervously for their turn to practice. The boy stood near the back of the room, holding the small piece of paper with the order of performances. His name was written close to the end. As he waited, he watched other students step onto the stage. Some sang loudly into microphones while their friends clapped from the audience seats. Others practiced dance routines while teachers watched carefully. The room felt busy and noisy. Finally, a teacher called his name. For a moment his legs felt heavy, but he walked forward anyway. When he stepped onto the stage, several students in the audience seats looked up. A few of them whispered quietly to each other. The boy tried not to notice. He walked to the piano and sat down on the bench. For a second he stared at the keys. The bright stage lights made them look slightly different from usual. He took a slow breath. Then he began to play. The first notes were soft, just like he had practiced. The auditorium was not completely silent because students were still moving around, but some people began to notice the music. A few teachers stopped talking and turned toward the stage. The melody slowly grew stronger. Even though this was only a rehearsal, the music still carried emotion. The boy forgot about the students watching him and focused on the keys. When he finished, the room stayed quiet for a moment. Then one teacher nodded with clear surprise. "That was very good," the teacher said kindly. The boy felt his face grow warm. Compliments like that were rare for him. He stood up quickly and stepped off the stage. As he walked back toward the exit, he noticed something interesting. A few students who had been whispering earlier were now looking at him with curiosity instead of amusement. The rehearsal ended soon after. That evening, as he walked home under the fading sunlight, his mind felt full of thoughts. The talent show would take place the very next night. Soon the auditorium would be full of people. Parents would sit in the front rows. Teachers would stand along the walls. Students would fill the rest of the chairs. Some might still expect him to fail. But after the rehearsal, he felt a little less afraid. When he reached home, his mother was preparing dinner again. The warm smell of food filled the small apartment. She noticed the thoughtful look on his face. "Big day at school?" she asked. He nodded slowly. "There's an event tomorrow," he said quietly. "Oh?" she replied with interest. "The school talent show." His mother smiled. "That sounds exciting." He hesitated again before speaking. "I signed up to play the piano." For a moment she simply stared at him in surprise. Then her face slowly softened with pride. "You did?" she said. The boy nodded. "I've been practicing after school." She walked closer and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "I wish I had known," she said softly. "I would have loved to hear you practice." He looked down shyly. "I wanted it to be a surprise." She smiled warmly. "Well," she said, "no matter what happens tomorrow, I'm already proud of you." Those words stayed in his mind long after dinner ended. Later that night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he imagined the moment again and again, walking onto the stage, sitting at the piano, pressing the first note. Somewhere inside the quiet auditorium of his imagination, the music began to play, and he hoped that when the real moment came, his courage would be just as strong. The evening of the talent show arrived sooner than the boy expected. All day at school, the excitement had been impossible to ignore. Students talked about the event in every hallway, and teachers reminded everyone about the schedule. By the time the final bell rang, the entire building seemed filled with nervous energy. The boy walked home slowly that afternoon. His backpack felt lighter than usual, but his thoughts felt heavy. In just a few hours, he would be standing on the stage in front of the whole school. When he reached the small apartment above the grocery store, his mother was already getting ready to leave for the event. She had finished work early that day so she could attend. She had even chosen one of her nicest dresses, simple but neat. When she saw him enter the room, she smiled warmly. "Ready for tonight?" she asked. The boy shrugged slightly, trying to hide his nerves. "I think so," he said quietly. His mother walked over and gently straightened the collar of his shirt. "You don't have to be perfect," she told him. "Just play the way you practiced." He nodded, holding on to those words. Later that evening they walked together back toward the school. The sky was slowly growing darker, and lights from the building could already be seen glowing through the windows. As they approached the entrance, they saw groups of students and parents arriving. People talked excitedly as they walked inside. The boy's stomach tightened when he realized just how many people would be watching. Inside the auditorium, the room looked completely different from the quiet place where he had practiced for weeks. Rows of chairs were filled with parents and students. Teachers stood near the walls helping organize everything. Bright lights shone toward the stage, making it the center of attention. The piano stood there quietly, waiting. The boy took a seat with the other performers near the side of the stage. From there he could see almost the entire audience. The room buzzed with conversation and laughter. He spotted a few students who had whispered about him before. Some of them glanced his way and nudged their friends. One of them whispered something and chuckled. The boy felt his hands grow slightly cold. But then he noticed his mother sitting in the audience a few rows back. She gave him a small wave and a reassuring smile. Seeing her there helped calm him. The show began with the school principal stepping onto the stage to welcome everyone. The audience applauded politely as the event officially started. The first performance was a group dance. Several students ran onto the stage and began moving to loud music. The crowd clapped along with the rhythm, and laughter filled the room when one of the dancers nearly slipped but recovered quickly. After that came a singer with a powerful voice. The audience listened carefully and applauded when the song ended. Performance after performance followed. Some acts were impressive. Others were funny. A few were a little awkward, but the crowd remained supportive. As time passed, the boy felt his turn getting closer. He looked down at his hands and quietly moved his fingers, imagining the piano keys beneath them. The melody he had practiced so many times played in his mind. A teacher standing near the performers leaned over to him. "You're coming up soon," the teacher said gently. The boy nodded. A few minutes later, the host of the event stepped onto the stage again and looked down at the list of names. "And now," the host announced, "we have a piano performance." The audience shifted slightly in their seats. The host read the boy's name. For a moment everything seemed to slow down. The boy stood up. He could already hear whispers moving through the audience as he walked toward the stage. Some students recognized him immediately. "Isn't that the quiet kid?" someone whispered. "I didn't know he could play," another voice said. A few soft laughs followed. The boy heard them, but he kept walking. When he stepped onto the stage, the bright lights made it difficult to see the audience clearly. But he could still feel hundreds of eyes watching him. The piano bench waited in front of the instrument. He sat down slowly. For a brief moment, the whispers continued. A few students expected something awkward or funny to happen. The boy placed his hands gently on the keys. His heart was beating quickly. He remembered the many quiet afternoons he had spent in this room, practicing when no one else was around. Back then, the chairs had been empty. Now every seat was filled. He took one slow breath. Then he pressed the first note. The sound floated through the auditorium like a clear bell. Something unexpected happened immediately. The whispers stopped. The audience grew quiet. The boy played the next notes softly, letting the melody begin exactly the way he had practiced. The gentle opening filled the room with a calm and emotional sound. Students who had been leaning back in their chairs slowly sat up. Teachers exchanged surprised looks. The music continued. His fingers moved across the keys with confidence. The melody flowed smoothly, rising and falling like a story being told without words. The quiet beginning slowly grew stronger. Each note seemed to carry a feeling: hope, struggle, determination. The audience listened carefully now. No one laughed anymore. No one whispered. The boy forgot about the crowd watching him. The music had pulled him back into the same focus he always felt during practice. He moved into the middle section of the piece, where the melody became faster and more powerful. His fingers traveled across the keyboard with surprising speed. Some parents in the audience leaned forward in their seats. Even the students who had expected to laugh were now staring in disbelief. The boy continued playing, completely lost in the music. He thought about his mother working long hours. He thought about the days he felt invisible at school. All of those feelings seemed to flow into the notes. The final section of the piece arrived. This part was the strongest and most emotional part of the music. His fingers pressed the keys with energy and confidence. The sound filled every corner of the auditorium. For a moment it felt like the entire room was breathing along with the melody. Then the final notes rang out. The sound echoed gently through the room before fading into silence. For a few seconds no one moved. The entire auditorium remained completely quiet. The boy slowly lifted his hands from the piano keys. Then suddenly, someone in the audience began clapping. Another person joined. Within seconds the entire room erupted into loud applause. Students stood up from their chairs. Parents clapped enthusiastically. Teachers smiled with clear amazement. Quickly became a full standing ovation. The boy looked out at the audience, almost unable to believe what was happening. Among the cheering crowd, he saw his mother standing and clapping proudly, tears shining in her eyes. The same students who had whispered earlier were now applauding just as loudly as everyone else. In that moment, the quiet boy who had once felt invisible realized something powerful. Sometimes all it takes is one moment, and one note to change everything. For several long seconds after the final note faded away, the boy remained sitting at the piano bench. The sound of the applause filled the entire auditorium, echoing off the walls and the high ceiling. It felt almost unreal. Just a few minutes earlier, Some of those same people had been whispering and laughing. Now they were standing, clapping, and cheering loudly. The boy slowly stood up from the bench. The bright stage lights made it difficult to see every face clearly, but he could feel the energy in the room. The applause did not stop. Some students even whistled in excitement. He looked down for a moment, feeling shy and overwhelmed at the same time. Then he gave a small bow the way he had seen performers do in videos. The applause grew even louder. From the audience, his mother stood proudly with both hands raised as she clapped. Her eyes were shining with tears, but her smile was wider than he had ever seen. For years she had worked long days and nights just to keep their small life moving forward. Seeing her son standing on that stage filled her with a kind of happiness that was hard to describe. After a few moments, the host of the talent show returned to the stage. "That was incredible," the host said into the microphone, clearly surprised. "Let's hear that applause one more time." The crowd clapped again. The boy felt his face growing warm, but this time it was not from embarrassment. It was from a quiet pride he had never felt before. He stepped off the stage and returned to the side area where the other performers were waiting. Several students who had performed earlier were now looking at him with wide eyes. One of them leaned closer and said, "I didn't know you could play like that." Another simply shook his head in amazement. The boy smiled shyly but did not say much. He was still trying to understand what had just happened. The rest of the talent show continued, but the energy in the auditorium felt different now. Many people kept whispering about the piano performance they had just heard. "Who knew he could play like that?" someone said from the audience. "That was beautiful," another parent commented quietly. Even some teachers looked impressed. Near the back of the room, the school janitor stood beside the door, watching the rest of the show. He had recognized the melody and the confidence in the boy's playing. He smiled to himself, remembering the quiet afternoons when he had heard piano music drifting through the hallway. After the final performance ended, the host returned to the stage again to thank everyone for coming. Students and parents slowly began standing up and gathering their belongings. The auditorium quickly filled with conversation. Backstage, the boy picked up his backpack and prepared to leave. As he stepped into the hallway, a few students approached him. One of them, who had once whispered jokes near the lockers, looked slightly embarrassed. "That was really good," the student admitted. The boy nodded politely. Another student asked, "Where did you learn to play like that?" The boy hesitated for a moment before answering. "I practiced after school," he said simply. They looked surprised but impressed. Soon after, his mother found him near the auditorium doors. The moment she saw him, she wrapped him in a warm hug. "I knew you would do something amazing," she said softly. The boy smiled. "I was really nervous," he admitted. She stepped back and looked at him proudly. "Well, you didn't show it," she said. "You looked like you belonged on that stage." Those words meant more to him than the applause. As they walked out of the school building together, the cool night air felt refreshing after the crowded auditorium. Students and parents passed by them, still talking about the performances. A few people recognized the boy and nodded with friendly smiles. One teacher even stopped them near the entrance. "That was a wonderful performance," the teacher said sincerely. "Have you ever taken piano lessons?" The boy shook his head. The teacher looked surprised. "Well," the teacher continued, "you clearly have a natural gift. You should keep playing." The boy thanked the teacher quietly. As he and his mother walked down the sidewalk toward home, the town felt calm again. Streetlights cast soft yellow circles on the pavement, and the distant sounds of cars moved through the quiet night. For a few minutes they walked without speaking. Then his mother said something softly. "You know," she began, "when you played tonight, it felt like the whole room stopped breathing." The boy looked at her with curiosity. "That music, it came from your heart," she said. He thought about that for a moment. The truth was simple. Every note he had played carried a piece of his story. The struggles, the quiet afternoons, the dreams he had kept hidden. When they reached their apartment building, he paused for a moment before going upstairs. Across the street, the lights of the grocery store were still on. A few people walked along the sidewalk, unaware that something important had happened just down the road. But for the boy, everything felt different now. The next morning at school, the change was even more noticeable. As he walked through the hallway, several students greeted him with friendly smiles. Some nodded in respect. Others simply said, "Great performance last night." The whispers were gone. Instead of seeing him as the quiet kid in worn shoes, people now saw him as the boy who had silenced an entire crowd with a single piano note. Even teachers mentioned the performance during class. "That talent show had many good acts," one teacher said. "But that piano performance was unforgettable." The boy sat quietly at his desk, listening. He did not feel like a different person. He was still the same quiet boy who liked to observe the world more than talk about it. But something inside him had changed. He now understood that his voice did not have to be loud to be heard. Sometimes a simple melody could say more than words ever could. That afternoon, after classes ended, he walked toward the auditorium again. The hallway was quiet just like before. When he opened the doors and stepped inside, the empty room greeted him with familiar silence. The piano was still there on the stage, waiting. He walked up and sat at the bench once more. His fingers touched the keys gently. The music began again, soft and calm, filling the room the way it always had. But this time he knew something important. The world had finally heard what he had been quietly practicing all along. And this was only the beginning.